Here's Brodie Brazil.
I think the headline of this article says it best. Quote, "It's embarrassing." I'm talking about what has happened between the FCC and the FAA, 5G and radio altimeters for aircraft. There's a lot of conflict here. All these entities are in the communications business, and they didn't communicate. Now they've got a problem. Let me read you the article here. Lawmakers on Thursday sharply criticized the process leading up to the deployment of 5G wireless technology around airports last month, repeatedly questioning how the FAA and FCC had such a disconnect. Representative Garrett Graves of Louisiana says there's, quote, "no excuse for us to be in this situation," he said at a hearing. "It's embarrassing, it's ridiculous, and it's inexcusable." Now, I'm not sure what his background on aviation is or anything else about him, but I firmly agree with that assessment. It is ridiculous how we've got to this point and how two sides are kind of just operating on their own principles, and they never actually heard each other or heard concerns or ironed this out before they realized, we've got a problem. At the issue is a chunk of the spectrum. We're talking about the frequency spectrum here called the C-band, adjacent to bandwidth used by aircraft radar altimeters. Radar altimeters, radio altimeters, this is the device on the airplane which essentially sits on the belly and looks straight down at the ground. Now, it's not constantly operating, but when the aircraft is in lower altitudes, it is its own radar. Now, there's a whole altimeter system on the aircraft, which is separate from this. This is a radar or radio altimeter, which literally uses radar to shoot the beam at the ground. And then when that reflects, it figures out exactly in real time how far off the ground the airplane is. This system, critical to performing Category 2 or Category 3 instrument landing. So we're talking about when the weather and the visibility is at its worst, and the aircraft is essentially doing the majority of a landing on its own with little human intervention. It really needs that radar or radio altimeter. And if there is any kind of interference there, that spells trouble in a lot of different ways. So you're essentially putting all those lives at risk, performing what is a pretty routine flight normally, but now you're adding an element of instability to this approach. You kind of just don't know how it's always going to go. Let's go back to the article here. At the issue is that chunk of the spectrum, the C-band, adjacent to bandwidth used by aircraft radar altimeters to navigate in these low visibility situations. After Verizon and AT&T bought the bandwidth in February 2021 for more than $80 billion, the aviation industry worried publicly that deploying that spectrum would put airplanes at risk. So the FCC sold the 5G band or something adjacent to it, too close to it, essentially. And you know that they're going to use every single wave of that frequency spectrum, those communications companies are, but it's so close to the radar altimeter here that it could cause interference. It's the hard thing here because the FAA has been using that for decades now without any issue. And now the FCC kind of is like a neighbor, and they're too close and they just built too big a house and they sold it for way too much money. They can't now go back on it. So you can clearly see what the issue at hand here is. The deployment was delayed multiple times, but the telecoms, the FAA and FCC have appeared to reach a temporary detente, with Verizon and AT&T agreeing not to deploy in areas close to airports and putting a series of mitigations in for at least 6 months. The only thing I can think of, the only resolution that could make sense here is if there was some system in place where if the telecom companies knew when the ILS was being used or when visibility was that low and they turned down or turned off those 5G antennas, transmitters near airport sites. And I think there's about 80 airports across the country which have Category 2 and 3 instrument approaches, and it would necessitate aircraft with radar altimeters. But again, sometimes they're used just in normal operations and in perfect weather. And now you're talking about them not working under those circumstances. They're being unreliable. That's not something that a flight crew wants to deal with last moment, unexpected, is that something's not working because cell phone towers are throwing it off. So I do think if there was a resolution, maybe it could be something to the extent of coordinating, using the band when it's not normal weather, normal operations, and then shutting the band down or turning it down when you realize that radio altimeters are imperative. But again, this is quite the conundrum. Interested to see how this shakes out. But right now, quite a problem, and really most frustrating, a problem that just did not need to exist.